Hello, everyone, and I'm terribly sorry not to be there. I am at home with my eldest daughter, who's tested positive this week. So she is thrilled to be watching some cartoons, and she may come and wave and say hello, but we are all rolling with the punches. But I'm very sorry not to be there because you are on my home turf and very familiar ground to me. The amount of time I've spent in the assembly rooms for the many years of work I've done in Lambeth, particularly in and around youth services, but that spans all of the different aspects that touch on youth services, whether it be within justice, community safety, substance misuse, and obviously within formal and informal education sectors. In particular, the group that I worked predominantly with was the NEET population. So how did working with predominantly NEET young people in Lambeth get me to pirates? Well, some of you might think that's not too big a jump, depending on the young people that you work with. And that was certainly my experience. I worked with the most fascinating and fantastic young people. This was my office for 15 years. It's about 100, maybe less, about 90 meters from where you're sitting right now. If you were looking to the left, you'd be looking directly at the town hall. This is on Brighton Terrace, so it's looking back towards the Trinity Square. And that on the right is, on the left is me with the publication Live magazine that we used to print and distribute across Lambeth. And there's Celeste, the editor at the time. That was the minister for the third sector back when there was such a thing. And that, of course, is Super Mario on the right-hand side. And that kind of summed up our approach to youth work. We were able to bring big business, brands, the intersection of policy in a series of interventions that were always 100% determined by young people. And over my life working within youth services, I grew, my respect for young people grew and grew and grew. And the more I worked particularly in the justice systems, in and around entrepreneurship, the more platforms we gave to young people, the more we discovered young people were really able to design the most successful of all the interventions and solutions that we made. However, I'd set Livity up when I was in my 20s, and I'd always said that I was going to leave when I got old, because Livity was dedicated to young people. And that was fine when I was in my 20s, and people would say, when's that going to be? So I'd say when I hit 40, because in my 20s, 40 seemed like it was never going to happen, and then obviously that did roll around. And there we were 2 years ago, and I was no longer amidst all of these incredible young people and all of that energy that, you know, working directly on the front line of the issues that matter most can give you. And I found myself really frustrated. I think the landscape upon which we're all trying to fight the good fight felt like it was, in many ways, kind of worse than ever. You know, after years of arbitrary funding cuts, after years of kind of a pull away from government, which I'd known, things felt really precarious. And around that, you know, we'd just gone through a referendum. The rest of the world seemed like it was unraveling a little bit as well. And so I was really curious to look at new avenues for change. And I began to write a book. I wrote a book because I'm dyslexic. I didn't make it to, I only barely finished my A-levels up the top of Brixton Hill towards Croydon. And I was very frustrated. And I was looking at different examples. And in the mentoring groups of young entrepreneurs that I run, I was beginning to talk about how business can change the world, how organizations can change themselves. And some of the young entrepreneurs that I work with looked back at me and go, like, what are you talking about, Sam? This has got really boring. And one of the young men that I'd worked with for a long time, he said, where are all the pirates? And I realized that this was a euphemism I'd used all my life. And actually, because I decided to try and write a book and to talk about change in a grown-up and professional manner, I'd lost all of the elements that had helped me and made me successful in the world of actual social change. And so I went and pulled on that thread of where are all the pirates, and I began to look into why had I always used this metaphor and euphemism of pirates. And a book and a story and a message and a structure of change began to begin. And I looked into the real life and true stories of how what piracy meant 300 years ago exactly, and how they rewrote the rules, not just broke the rules, how they redistributed power, and really how they told a tall tale that puts them on the arc of social change alongside really any of the famous figureheads of the British working class. And now that's obviously not what most people think when they think of pirates. And so when I say be more pirate, I know that it's a really open call to action to a number of different interpretations of courage and mischief and changing things. But I also know that all of you, many of you working directly in frontline services over the last couple of years, may be raising an eyebrow, like, actually, how useful is piracy going to be to me right now? Doesn't that sound a little bit dangerous? And I would accept that, because we all know where the story of pirates comes from. We all know that we have this association with them. I've got two little girls. Both of them have been to pirate fancy dress theme parties. And we all know there is no other murderous rogue in history that we let our kids dress up as and celebrate in this way. but there is something about pirates that we all have a slightly different association with. And so, talking of our children, it was for my children that I really wrote this book. Yes, my own frustrations have changed, but at the time, this is Scarlett, who's currently on the sofa. Hi, Scarlett. Talking about you now. And the book is dedicated to her. When it was out, she was really pleased because she could see her name in the front cover. She continued to flip through the pages, and she continued to look really pleased, which was surprising because she doesn't read very many business books. But I was really pleased that she was pleased. And she said, Daddy, you've made a mistake. I said, what? I can imagine that, having your first book, the big mistake pointed out by your 6-year-old daughter. She said, yes, Daddy, you've written a book about pirates with no pictures in it. I was like, oh, Scarlett, you're right. That's a really good criticism. And so I said, well, listen, darling, it's kind of about those pirates and why I think they're important for us. But really, it's about your future, and it's the world that you're going to grow up in, because I spent nearly 15 years trying to change the world to make it better. And I've pulled on the levers of policy, and I've pulled on the levers of volunteering, I've pulled on the levers of big business, and I've tried my hardest. And somehow I think the world isn't necessarily getting better. And in many ways, it's getting worse. And what I've begun to realize is that the rules that exist around all of these systems are inherently unfair. And whilst we try and fight the good fight on the streets and in the communities around us, if we don't address the fact that the rules are unfair, well, then fundamentally nothing's going to work. Because once you've worked out that the game is rigged and you carry on playing by the rules, then you play to lose. Which was no way to describe anything to a 6-year-old, obviously. But I was working it out in my own head, you know, my approach to social change, the change that I felt so passionate and believed in. But as I know many of our colleagues will feel at times incredibly disheartened by the ability to bring about change. Now, encouraging rule breaking is precarious. And I know many of you there are in policing. So we've got to, any of you actually treading carefully around rule breaking and social care and otherwise. So if they were ever going to treat rule breaking sensitively, it's when you're talking to a 6-year-old who you are solely responsible for the parenting of. So to find a way of bringing this to life, Scarlett had been studying the Suffragettes at school, and it was the same week the book was out that this statue was unveiled up in Parliament Square, the first statue of a woman ever in Parliament Square. And so I took Scarlett to meet Millicent, and we discussed what Millicent gave to society, what Millicent represents for women and equality more generally, and that this woman undoubtedly was breaking the rules. Fundamentally, 100 years ago, she broke the rules, she risked her life, she risked her livelihood, she risked her reputation, she risked everything that was held near to her, and at the time, contextually, she was breaking all the rules. But we would all argue, I imagine, that historically, we can see that she was doing the right thing. And this is where I think it begins to get interesting, because very often we are working with out-of-date rules. You know, the times and the conditions that we're moving in are so fast, and we don't necessarily have the tools that we need to creatively, responsibly challenge, update, and improve the rules. Now, this really resonated with Scarlett, and we began to walk around Parliament Square, and she asked me stories of the other statues that are up there, and I'm no historian, as any of you who might read the book will find out. But one thing I did recognize was that we very rarely give statues to people for just following orders. And really, usually we give people statues for the moment in which they challenge conventions and they update the systems that we're in. And that seems to be a fundamental part of what we then, in time, recognize as heroic service. But it's a very hard moment for anyone to go through, because you're going to challenge what exists, and that's incredibly hard and isolating, and then make it better. Well, that's tough, because we don't know what it is that we're actually working towards. One of Scarlett's more contemporary heroes is this young lady, also carrying a placard, also absolutely breaking the rules, you know, very fundamental. If you're 15 years old, you're supposed to go to school. But again, is history going to look back and judge that this young woman did the wrong thing? And that is why I got really obsessed about the story of pirates, because there are moments of great social change that we know of, some of which I've just touched on. And how do we really change the big systems that we're in, the large institutions? And if you have those frustrations of how difficult institutional change is, then we really have to look at these kind of examples where rights were formed and where entire histories were transformed. And that's where I put the golden age of pirates. And many people will, you know, almost laugh or are concerned that I'd put Jack Sparrow next to the civil rights movement, like that's sensitive. But actually, it's completely true. Because what I discovered is what very few people know: the true history of Golden Age pirates. So if you'll allow me 5 minutes before I'll bring this back to a contemporary setting and why it might be useful for us, the true story of Golden Age pirates revolves around individuals like Black Sam Bellamy, who at 19 escaped poverty in North Devon, set out to sea, and was brutally treated by the Merchant Navy and the Royal Navy until he decided to start an independent community forged around a set of beliefs and fairness and equality, and it's why he became known as the Prince of Pirates, or even the Robin Hood of pirates, because whilst he became rich and famous for his plunder, he became even more infamous and even more successful for his arguments for equality, for justice, for equal rights, for common people the world over. Or you could talk about Black Caesar, who during the time of the Golden Age of pirates was one of the very many black leaders. In fact, the overall pirate community was about 30%, 33% non-white. So way ahead of most contemporary like diversity kind of targets. And it wasn't just diversity in the sense that we know it. There was full equality, equality in pay, equality in say, equality in leadership opportunities. An amazing black historian called Kenneth Kincaid, who studies this specifically, argues it was the only institutions on earth at the time where there was even an opportunity of this level of equality. And it wasn't just equality around ethnicity, it was equality in terms of gender, because also on board pirate communities and pirate ships, there was equal gender rights. And so there weren't as many female pirates, but there were certainly some incredible figureheads. Anne Bonny is one of my favorite stories of all time, fearlessly leading her men and creating stories of justice and fairness that traveled the world. And when I say traveled the world, I truly do mean travel the world, because the most enduring image of Anne Bonny is this, which was an image that then went on to inform the most famous picture of Lady Livity, which then went on to inform the most iconic statue of Livity. So these stories that traveled the world in a very, very unfair, unjust, and changing time. This is pre-democracy Britain, so pre-democracy the world. This group of young people, they were the millennials of their age, average age was 28, who didn't just make a mess of the rules of society. They rejected a really, really unfair society, and they set out to create some new patterns and new behaviors. And I'll give you some facts if this is sounding a bit far-fetched. On board pirate ships, you saw the first of its kind in terms of networked and democratic decision-making. Of course, democracy was formed in early Athens, but that was a democracy which only in which white men of a certain age were enabled to vote, which was less than 30% of the population. In these new sophisticated communities that were known as pirate communities, everybody had equal say. And that wasn't because they were pioneers of democracy, it's because they were sick of out-of-touch autocracy, where they didn't have any agency or voice. Now, also, if they'd been through the Merchant Navy or the Royal Navy, the largest employers of the time, if you were injured, you'd be left for dead. Absolutely left for dead. So they rewrote that rule as well, and they created a compensation system. That's where all the famous stories of wooden legs and hooks comes from, because you'd be given enough money to be repaired and then be able to retire on the back of it. There was a system of collaboration and of dual governance. We know this in many of our organizations, where we really hold true to our systems of dual governance, of checks and balances, of the fairnesses that are required to protect people. Now, that didn't happen in the Merchant Navy or the Royal Navy. You had out-of-control autocracy, and there was massive exploitation. So there were two figureheads on board a pirate ship, a captain and a quartermaster, one in charge of strategy and the other in charge of culture, and they had equal say. It was a really, truly democratic and dynamic system. They went even further. Knowing how ruthless the days were and exploitative, they created a fair pay system where there was an upper and lower threshold. And so if it had been a profitable year, everybody did well. And if it hadn't been such a good year, then everybody suffered the consequences. And I can give you, we haven't got time for it, but I can give you many, many more of these incredible statistics and historical facts. And there's no question of any of these things. This was a profoundly innovative period of around 25 years. And these sophisticated communities, their stories traveled the world, not because they were ruthless raiders, far from it. They were seen as the least violent people at sea at the time, because you put them up against the East India Company or the Spanish Armada, but also because economically they had no reason to fight. They wanted to protect their assets. And so instead of fighting, they built this incredible famous brand that would create a surrender scenario on site. So they were actually far less violent, far more sophisticated, far more fair, and far less autocratic than the systems of the time. And their stories, therefore, traveled the world because they offered that which no one had: freedom and fairness, and democracy and a say. And what they really represented was the end of there'd been 100-year war up until that point, and absolutely no one had any chance of any kind of social movement. And so they offered a chance of advancement. And so this spirit of freedom really had an awful lot of power and potency to it. And it wasn't just within their organizational structures, I should add. within pirate communities, you saw the first of its kind ever same-sex union was not just allowed, but it was celebrated. It was so sophisticated it even had an inheritance clause. And you put that against, execution, which would have been your sentence for homosexual behavior in the Royal Navy. And you really see how challenging and advanced these guys were. And when we now think about rule breaking, perhaps we really think about something far more pioneering. And if there's one historical fact left that I always kind of treasure, it's this, and it's that pirates invented the cocktail. Now, I don't know if there are any cocktail fans amongst you or historians, but it's widely thought that the first ever cocktail recorded in history was the old-fashioned on a menu that appeared in Manhattan in 1836. But it wasn't. So Francis Drake put together rum, lime, mint, sugar, yeah, basically a caipirinha, a mojito, and it was called El Draque. That took place 200 years before. So you get a sense, my friends, that there is a real role that pirates have to play. And I discovered in my research for the book that I wasn't alone in this. Lots of people have made these discoveries, pirate historians, and there's a few pirate economists. But over many years, this story is squashed. And certainly at the time, it was absolutely deleted from the history books because it represented what the powers were most scared of, which was decision-making and democracy. This comes about 60 years ahead of the American Revolution. It comes 20 years ahead of the Parliament Act that began to enable these kind of rights. It's 140 years before the first fights for workers' rights took place, things that became enabled human rights. This was seditious talk. But what transpires is this spirit of challenging rules. You can see it again and again. You see it in moments when business models fail, when new territories are needed. In moments like this, in moments when we look around ourselves and find many of our institutions not delivering, us working on practices that were perhaps right and relevant maybe a decade or more ago or generations ago, but they're letting us down and they're letting the people that we protect down. And they need updating, and we can get frustrated at saying they should be updated, at another report that will be written to tell us things that the last report said. Many people are, you'll all be aware of the kind of tragic circumstances where that's going on right now. So what do we do to do it differently? There has to be a moment when we step up to these notions and challenge and change them. And this isn't, me with an irresponsible call to just rip up rule books. This is really looking at historically across industry, what happens when we do. There's a quote that I put on the front of the book, and it's from Steve Jobs. When he was insolvent, when Apple was about to close and IBM were absolutely putting the pressure on them and they were going to shut down. And he wrote up on the wall of a team of 10 people that went away for a 2-day offsite. So not dissimilar to where you guys are now, taking time out to really rethink who we are and how we're going to take on the challenges. And rather than just think about what's wrong, he went even further and said, we'd rather be a pirate than join the Navy. And it's why they flew the pirate flag over Apple the day he died, because it's the moment that the team came together and invented the Mac Classic, that piece of technology that then reinvented history. So I can look to the golden age of pirates, or I can look to many points throughout history where this spirit was invoked. And that's really the spirit that I try and invoke through the book. My experience on nearly 2 decades of working at the front end and the tough end of social change, and not just all across the United Kingdom, from Brixton to Bradford to Belfast, which I have, but I've taken my ideas and taken them around the world. So we set up offices in Athens and worked with really tough groups there throughout the financial struggles they went through. I've got teams that have been in Lagos and in Nairobi. We've had over a decade now in South Africa, working in many townships there. And the corresponding challenges that face young people and all of the communities that come around them, and the opportunities as well as the risks, continue to be the same. And the overwhelming thought I've gone away with is this line: the biggest mistake we can make is to believe the way things are is the way they have to be. And this change that pirates brought about, again, I say, it wasn't that I've discovered the secret history of liberal social design. That wasn't it at all. They fundamentally knew that the rule game was rigged so badly, and so they refused to follow the rules. But the word that surprised me most, and this is really important, is that pirates became incredibly accountable. Because what happens when you challenge a rule and you try and create a new one, and you form a community around that new way of doing things, is you will have to become accountable to it. And that spirit that we will all see of buck passing and of back covering, which is necessary when things are run the way they are, changes. And entire communities become responsible for the rules they've created, and therefore for the change that they want to create. And I would go so far as to say that when we really look at rules, and I'm distinguishing myself from regulations here, the regulations that are there to protect and save lives,
are sacrosanct, right? And we need to be very clear on that. I'm not talking about changing or challenging law. And if we look up the Oxford English Dictionary, we're talking about the rules, a set of understood or implicit principles, and they govern conduct, within a particular activity or sphere. Now, we know that often it's the unwritten rules that affect us most. It's the culture that stops us or prevents us from speaking up and speaking out. So I'm going to argue that rule breaking, this is my definition of it, becomes when we see it's a rule that gets in the way of good work, gets in the way of the vision and the reason that we're all here, and or doesn't make lives better, then actually challenging those rules is no longer a risky thing to do, albeit perhaps there's still some risk, but it becomes a responsible thing to do, because it is one of the few levers of change that we really have left, because we know how change works, and very often change doesn't work. And I know I'm on sensitive ground here, but I don't arrive here theorizing from the edges. I arrive here from 2 decades of working right amidst it and continuing, over 2 decades, continuing to show up either at magistrate's court or in the street or in a cell or in the worst instances at a funeral, and knowing the reasons that brought us there again and again. And so I ask in all of this, when people say to me, either this is, too risky or well, we've already heard things like this. Well, and then I say, well, what's stopping us? If we know that we should be challenging things and speaking up more so, but what is it that gets in the way? And every time I've asked that question, I'm given so many great answers, from meetings to bureaucracy to form filling to, all the challenges we face, to our own careers, to management, of course, always management. But I've never heard an answer that doesn't sit outside, broadly speaking, fear and admin. And that's tough, I know, and this is not a direct criticism, because I will have worked, if not directly with you, then with many of your colleagues, and I understand the frustrations that are there, and they're real. Like, even if you're just talking about the email or the communications overload, it does stop us. But I would hate us to look back at this particular moment of great fragility and think, when we could see what the problems were, and we could see that there was a way of doing it, and we wouldn't let, the kind of the rule book, in inverted commas, be the thing that got in the way. And, this is easy for me to say from my kitchen, beaming into you, and you're the ones who'll leave today and go back into these frontline positions. So I'll put myself in the front line. This book came out at a point for me when I was in a precarious moment, that in business that I love, that's still just around the corner from you, seeing young people every single day. I was no longer the chief exec. I stood down. I was going through massive precarious in my own life. I was going through a separation, and you've already seen, I've got some wonderful daughters that I love very much. And so it was really at risk of making sure that I could still do the thing that I found most important. And I was having a meeting with my publisher, and they just revealed to me some budget cuts, and that the budget for the book was going to be slashed to nothing. And I was very frustrated, and also very scared. And this room that I was in was where the marketing department sat, just in here. And I was looking out through those windows. This is on Vauxhall Bridge Road, so many of you will know it, 6 lanes of traffic up to Victoria train station. And I thought, crikey, I'm either going to let this book go under and all my hard work and with no budget behind it whatsoever, or I'm going to do something. Now, before I started Livity in Brixton, I used to run nightclubs and events. So I thought to myself, how amazing would this window look if I put a fly poster in there, if I did something to really challenge the status quo? And I got a quote, and it was going to cost about 1,700 quid, and that was more than I could afford at the time. And I went and found the building manager, Trevor, and he said there was absolutely no way, and he chased me out almost with a broom. And then I got a call from the chief exec, a lovely man called Tom Weldon, who said, Sam, could you come in and do a talk for us about your philosophies and how we might address that at Penguin and challenge some of the rules ourselves? So I said, yeah, Tom, sure, but you have to pay me £1,700. He said, well, we can't do that. We're publishing your book, etc. I said, well, I really need it for this. And then I realized I couldn't tell him. So he said, what is it you need it for? I said, I can't tell you, Tom. So he agreed for me to do the talk, and we went ahead and did it. And I went and secretly got the banner made. And then I forged a approval notice from Tom, giving me permission to install this banner over the front of his building, which of course I didn't have. And if anyone had looked closely, you'd see all the typos. I just Googled the Penguin logo and filled in the signature myself. And obviously I know that's outside of the realms of what I ought to do, but it was either that or let my book go under. So it was then a beautiful sunny day in May, and me and some guys, I bought some high-vis vests, and we snuck up to Penguin, and we installed a great pink banner the size of a Routemaster bus on the bottom floor of the building. I took some pictures, and then I ran away. There's me looking really smug and pleased with myself. Quite pleased with myself. However, I got back to Brixton, and the phone started ringing, but it was not with the media or the influencers that I hoped it would be. It was the managing director at Penguin telling me off, telling me to get back up there and take it down. Who the hell did I think I was? And actually, on the other end of the spectrum, all the clever journalists and coverage that I thought would then help me prove this point about challenging rules didn't come through. And I was in big trouble. And a big threat was made to me by the MD that I was going to be the first author to lose their book deal on the day of publication. And I had a real moment of what I'm advocating to you, that I knew things had to be differently, that I couldn't just let, what I knew in my gut, the spirit of this book and the message and the importance that I knew it had to have, or was I going to back down at the first furlong? And I decided no. And so I got on the phone and I spoke to absolutely everybody I could who had spoken to the book in the long year of putting it together, who I knew stood for change and who I knew was frustrated. And one of those was the kind of Virgin Unite, the community of all the different Virgin companies who do a lot of kind of good social work. And I spoke to them and I knew they were big supporters. And was there any way they could get one of these pictures up on high? And they managed to. And so about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Sir Richard Branson tweets his support of this thing, also talking about the need to seek forgiveness, not permission sometimes, to go out and challenge and change things. And as a result, the book climbed up the bestseller lists, and I was very, very lucky and managed to get away with it. And even more so, the book then came out in the States, and we managed to get a US book deal, and even more fun stunts and things followed, challenging Donald Trump on his first visit to the UK, taking my lovely daughter onto the news with me, doing everything we possibly could along the way that we were told not to do, to prove a point about doing it differently. And to finish, eventually, my publishers got tired of me. And they sat me down, the marketing director and the managing director, and they said, Conniff, are you here to sell some books? Or are you here to start your silly movement? And it was a great question, because I had got a little bit carried away, to be honest, and thinking I was clever. And this really, I needed to sell books. This was fundamental to my world and my life, which was very vulnerable at the time. But something else had begun to happen. And in response to these shenanigans and in response to the book, I'd started to get all manner of messages from professionals in every single industry and sector, at every single level, of people wanting to stand up to challenge and change, of people whose lives had been around change, had been people who we had all recognized as colleagues. And something about this message and the way that I conveyed it had reawakened an energy and a passion in them. And they came through thick and fast, hundreds of them, asking what they could do, asking how they could take it further, or really just letting me know that they were starting again. And this one, Nick, telling me that tomorrow is a day one scenario. And we know what that language means. That means that someone is taking a real risk and bringing about a change. So I was able to sit down with my publishers and my bosses and say, I hear you. And yeah, I am here to sell some books. But first and foremost, I'm here to make a change. And if my book is the lever of doing that, then we will have to work out a way that the business model sits on the back of that. And I'm not going to give up. And that led to me leaving parting company with Penguin, which is a huge risk for me to do then, but they simply wouldn't go forward with this. And I interviewed over 100 different people, and I've now had tens of thousands of stories of people. There's now a global community, I don't even run it, a global community of people who've read Beam or Pirate and gone into their sectors, be it within the armed forces, the NHS, the education system, health and safety, NATO, through to countless large organizations, charity, youth work. There really isn't an area that is important to me where this hasn't resonated. And so I wrote a sequel, rather than back down, rather than be scared away with it, as the need for change increases. And like I say, in this moment of great fragility, I don't want us to look back having accepted new normal as an update set of rules, when fundamentally, in my opinion, normal was part of the problem in the first place. So how do we rewrite these rules? Well, firstly, by challenging them, and then by recognizing that I'm not advocating chaos at all in any way, shape, or form. I'm advocating creativity. That's the lesson I took from the golden age of pirates: their creativity, their responsibility, and their surprising level of accountability. So in that, I hope there is something useful to all of you, for whom rules we all know are so important, but updating them is probably even more important than ever. With that, thank you very much, all of you, and good luck.